It is before dawn, and a woman is kneeling in the dark. Her knees are pressed against packed earth. Her breath is visible. In front of her, a mound of grey ash sits perfectly still, and buried somewhere inside that ash, invisible, is a single coal that has survived the night. She does not reach for it carelessly. She uncovers it the way you would uncover something alive. A twist of dry moss, a breath, controlled and patient, and then orange, a small trembling orange blooming in the dark, like something being born. This is not a scene from a museum plaque, this is a kitchen. It has no walls in the way you imagine walls. No counters, no burners, no refrigerator hum in the background. And yet, within the hour, this same fire will boil meat, bake bread, smoke fish, render fat, and warm a room full of people who are utterly dependent on this woman getting it right. Most people, when they picture Viking life, picture battle, longships cutting through fog, axes, shields, raids on foreign shores. That is not what kept them alive. What kept them alive was this, a fire that could not be allowed to die, a set of tools most modern people would not recognize, and a body of practical knowledge so precise, so refined, so quietly brilliant, that historians who attempt to recreate it today often fail on their first try. Because here is the uncomfortable truth hiding underneath the popular image of the Viking warrior. Survival was harder than war, and nothing tested that survival more relentlessly, more permanently, 3 times a day, every day, for an entire lifetime, than the question of how to turn raw, unforgiving material into food. To understand Viking cooking, you first have to understand something most people never think about. There was no such thing as the kitchen, not as a room, not as a separated space with a door you could close. In most Viking longhouses, the fire pit, the eldstad, sat directly in the center of the only room the family had. Cooking did not happen apart from living, it happened inside living. The same fire that boiled your dinner also lit your darkness, dried your clothes, warmed your children, and when the wind was wrong, filled the entire house with smoke so thick that archaeologists examining skeletal remains centuries later still find the evidence in blackened lung tissue and eye damage. This single fact reshapes everything. Cooking was not a task you performed, it was an atmosphere you lived inside. And that atmosphere depended entirely on one substance behaving correctly, every single day, without failure: fire. Here is where the first common belief collapses. Most people assume Vikings simply struck flint and steel whenever they needed a flame the way you'd flick a lighter. That is not what happened. Fire in the Viking Age was not something you casually created, it was something you preserved. Striking a new fire from raw flint and steel, using a curved iron striker and a spark, caught in dry tinder fungus, usually harvested from birch trees, was slow, unreliable, and physically demanding. It could take dozens of strikes. In damp Scandinavian air, it could take far longer. So households did something that sounds almost mythological today. They kept the fire alive continuously, sometimes for months, occasionally for years, banking the coals each night under ash, exactly like the woman in the opening scene, so that a single ember could be coaxed back to life by morning. Losing that ember was not a minor inconvenience. It meant no warmth, no cooked food, no boiled water. In the depth of a Scandinavian winter, it could mean death. This is the first thing that should unsettle you. An entire household's survival could hinge on whether one person, half asleep, buried the coals correctly the night before. Now expand the frame. One family, one fire pit, one meal at a time. That is the smallest unit of the story. But scale it upward, across a farmstead, a village, an entire trading town like Birka or Hedeby, and you begin to see something larger emerging. An entire civilization organized, quite literally, around the management of heat. Because fire wasn't just for cooking, it was currency of survival in a landscape that offered very little forgiveness. Long winters, short growing seasons, unpredictable seas, a diet that had to be built almost entirely from what could be grown, raised, hunted, or traded within a brutally narrow climate window. The question was never simply, what will we eat? The question was, how do we make food that will still be edible in February when nothing grows and the ships cannot sail? Cooking, in other words, was not just a bootteise. It was a technology of time. And this is where the Vikings' most underappreciated genius reveals itself, not in the fire itself, but in what they did with it. Consider the pot. Not iron. Iron was expensive, difficult to produce, and often reserved for weapons, tools, and the households that could afford it. For most ordinary Norse families, the primary cooking vessel was something stranger, soapstone. Soapstone, soft, carvable, heat-resistant, was quarried in blocks and hollowed out into thick-walled pots that could be hung directly over open flame without cracking. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of these vessels across Scandinavia, many worn smooth by generations of use. Their interior skillfully scanned by Schenkrius Oliski, these epochs reveal something quietly profound about how Vikings actually ate. Not roasted meat on a spit, dramatic and cinematic, the way film and television love to portray it. Boiled, long, slow, one pot boiling, meat, root vegetables, grains, wild greens, whatever the season allowed, simmered for hours over the central fire until it became something closer to a thick, nourishing stew than anything resembling a modern meal with separated components. There is a reason for this, and it is almost mathematically brutal. Boiling extracted maximum nutrition from minimum resources, fat rendered into the broth instead of dripping away and being lost. Tough, sinewy cuts of meat, the parts a modern diner would reject, became tender after hours of slow heat. Bones released marrow, nothing was wasted because nothing could be wasted. This single pot, hanging over this single fire, was doing something a modern kitchen full of specialized appliances does today, only with far more energy and far less patience. It was performing chemistry. And the person tending it understood, through generations of inherited, unspoken knowledge, exactly how long, how hot, and how much. But boiling alone could not feed a household through winter, and this is where the story shifts from cooking to something closer to engineering against time itself. Preservation, here is the second common belief that needs to be dismantled. Most people imagine that before refrigeration, people simply didn't have fresh food and ate poorly through the cold months. That is not what happened. Norse households developed an extraordinarily sophisticated preservation system, one built not around a single technique, but around reading the environment itself and using it as a tool. Smoke, salt, wind, cold, fermentation, each was deployed with precision, often in combination, depending entirely on what was being preserved and what resources were available in that particular region. Fish, abundant along Scandinavia's coastlines, was frequently dried in open air on wooden racks, using nothing but cold wind and low humidity to pull the moisture out until the flesh became hard, almost weightless, and capable of lasting for years without spoiling. This dried fish, known in later periods as screed, was not a delicacy. It was a lifeline. It could be traded, stored, carried on long sea voyages, and rehydrated by boiling when needed. Meat, particularly from autumn slaughter, when livestock was culled before winter to avoid feeding animals through the lean months, was salted, smoked over slow-burning fires, or both. The smokehouse, often a small structure separate from the main hall, filled with the low, constant curl of smoke from smouldering wood, was not decorative. It was a machine for stopping time. Bacteria could not survive what smoke and salt did to meat's surface. What went in as a raw, perishable animal came out, weeks later, as something that could sit through a Scandinavian winter without turning. And then there was fermentation, perhaps the most quietly radical of all Norse food technologies. Milk, difficult to preserve fresh, was transformed into skyr, a thick, tangy, protein-dense cultured product, created by allowing benevjol bagdri to de war